Welcome to the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's Jazz for Curious Listeners. My name is Lauren Schoenberg, and this is one of our This Year in Jazz series in which we investigate 12 months of the year, jazz recordings from each of those months. You know, so many times when we go back and listen to jazz from one of the great years in which jazz recordings were made, which is pretty much every year from 1917 on, we usually just pick the highlights, and by the highlights I mean the most famous recordings that are either innovative or that were so popular, some combination of those things. However, those recordings existed in context, and I think you can really appreciate those records by hearing other things recorded that year that are really great, that for whatever reason just never attained iconic status, but that are musically really exemplary. We're going to start with January 1938 and one of the original giants of jazz, especially of jazz piano. His name was Willie the Lion Smith, and along with James P. Johnson, he was one of the two innovators who arrived in New York in the late teens, early 20s, 1920s that is, and who created a style that was so influential that it can be pretty much heard in every jazz pianist in one way or another. You can really bring it back to James P. and Willie the Lion Smith, and also Jelly Roll Morton, who we will hear much later in this presentation. Willie the Lion Smith was known for composing pieces that, they had descriptive titles, and they kind of told the story. And they weren't just standard, sit and play a tune or sit and play the blues. They were just compositions. They were of a piece. This is why he was so influential on the young Duke Ellington, who actually recorded a tribute to the Lion in 1939 called Portrait of the Lion. In any case, the music really speaks for itself. Here is the great man himself with Passionate. One of the more fascinating things about Willie the Lion Smith was that he served with James Reese Europe in the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. And another member of that legendary African-American unit, and also a lot of musicians actually from the Caribbean were also in that unit, was Noble Sissle. And Noble Sissle was a member of a famous team with Eubie Blake, the pianist, and they were entertainers. They wrote the music for Shuffle Along, which was very famous in 1922 for bringing Black Broadway, which actually had been something that was happening in the early years of the 20th century. They brought it back with a flash. Great songwriters, great entertainers. Well, they split up at some point in the 1920s, and Noble Sissle became a very famous band leader. You don't hear his name much now because it was not one of the all-time great jazz orchestras. But he did have one of the all-time great jazz players featured for years in his band, and that was the New Orleans clarinetist and soprano saxophonist Sidney Bechet. And Sidney Bechet, even before Louis Armstrong, and he was about 3 years older than Louis, he had toured Europe, he had made brilliant recordings, and if there's any horn player that you can talk about before Armstrong, who was one of the all-time lights and inspirations of jazz, it's Sidney Bechet. Well, he spent years with Noble Sissle, and as you'll see, on February 10th, 1938, he made a recording called Black Stick, and he's featured on the clarinet and the soprano saxophone. Later on in this show, we'll also hear, from Louis Armstrong and from Jelly Roll Morton and others, just revealing that although this is usually thought of as the era of the big bands, and indeed it was in many ways, music from different eras were all still commingling and influencing each other. And even though it's known as the swing era, that's really too narrow a definition to encompass all the wonderful music. In any case, let's get to Bechet. Pianist Earl Hines, just 10 years earlier in 1928, had recorded, some absolutely brilliant piano solos for the QRS label, and also with Louis Armstrong, more famously, the West End Blues and Muggles and Squeeze Me and so many jazz classics, where he really announced a new brilliant abstract style of jazz piano that was, in a sense, radically different from James P. Johnson and William Lyon Smith and all the other things that were going on. Absolutely incredible musician. Well, he, unlike most of his peers, did not settle in New York. He was in Chicago, and he led a band at the Grand Terrace Ballroom for years and years, all throughout the very late 20s, through the 30s, into the early 1940s. And we have a recording here of his big band. In 1938, he was not featuring his piano so much on records. He plays short solos for the most part. He does get a nice taste here with the band, with that classic right-hand octave tremolo style. Interesting is that the vocal is by Ray Nance. Ray Nance, just about a little less than 2 years later, well, no, actually a little more than 2 years later, was to join Duke Ellington's band and shortly record Take the A Train, on which he played a very famous cornet solo. He played the trumpet, and he also played the violin. And a lot of folks don't remember that he was with Earl Hines for a while, so we'll hear him sing here and get a little bit of Earl on the piano and the swing in Chicago, Earl Hines Band of 1938.
Just originated something really new. They called it tipping. Let's go tipping. When the band begins to swing it, it will thrill you too. So let's go tipping. Let's go tipping. We'll swing lightly and politely all around the place, till the classes join the masses, taking all the space. Then when everyone is swinging, tell you what we'll do. We'll just keep tipping. Keep on tipping.
The focus on this show is on pianists and their innovations and where they were in 1938 and how fresh they all sound, and it makes for a really interesting comparison. This performance does not feature piano, but it does feature another percussion instrument, and that's the xylophone. And it's played by the band leader here, Red Norvo. By the way, he called it the xylophone. Later he played the vibes, he played the marimba. He had a very distinguished career for over half a decade. But his big band that existed between 1936 and the late 30s, actually went into the early 40s, but this edition of the band was very special, very musical, very subtle, and unique. It featured the arrangements of Eddie Sauter, who wrote for Benny Goodman, 1939, 1940, 41. and who later wrote the album Focus for Stan Getz. But he's one of the most original jazz orchestrators, and you can already hear on this recording of one of the lesser-known Ellington tunes his own style. You listen carefully for the voicings and the sounds and just the placement of everything. It's really different than anything else, as is the vocal, because the vocalist is Mildred Bailey. And in my estimation, along with Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and just a few others, she's one of the definitive vocalists recording in the 1930s. Her singing is much like Eddie Sauter's writing. It's subtle, and you have to listen carefully. Her phrasing, her pitch, everything is really remarkable. So, here we go, Mildred Bailey with Red Norvo. You may never have heard this before, and I hope it turns you into a fan of this great, great jazz orchestra.
If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you hold me in the same embrace as I'm holding you? Would you kiss and sigh just as I then for another kiss insist? Would you scheme and dream, treat me mean, then tell me that you can't resist? If you were in my place, what would you say? Would you say to me as I say to you, I feel that certain way, like a heart that never spoke before? Will yours say as mine, it's you I adore? If you were in my place, darling, what would you do? If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you hold me in the same embrace as I'm holding you? Would you kiss and sigh just as I then for another kiss insist? Would you scheme and dream, treat me mean, then tell me that you can't resist? If you were in my place, what would you say? Would you say to me as I say to you, I feel that certain way, like a heart that never spoke before? Will yours say as mine, it's you I adore? If you were in my place, darling, what would you do?
This is a fascinating recording. You know, when you think of the instrumentation, clarinet, piano, and drums, especially in the late 1930s, your thoughts usually go to the Benny Goodman small groups. When Goodman was a young kid in Chicago, he studied clarinet with a wonderful German teacher who taught very rigidly classical clarinet playing. His name was Franz Schepp. And at the same time, there was another student who was studying with Schepp at that time named Buster Bailey, whose real dream was to become a classical clarinetist. That was impossible at that time in the 1920s for a young African-American guy. Buster Bailey went into jazz famously so, playing with King Oliver and Louis Armstrong and Fletcher Henderson, and later on with John Kirby's band. In fact, he's with John Kirby's band at the time that this recording session is made. He's featured here, along with pianist Billy Kyle and drummer O'Neill Spencer, who were also in the John Kirby Sextet. But this is a feature for the three of them. And Billy Kyle, a fascinating pianist, who really had a big influence on Bud Powell, on Nat King Cole, on many pianists, Mel Powell also. There was something so incisive and driving about his attack and rhythm. It really sounds like no one else. You'll hear Buster Bailey playing with great technique and imagination, and the drummer O'Neill Spencer, who many people were fans of his, including Buddy Rich and Joe Jones and many other folks. He died much too young. He died in around 1943, 1944. But he's featured here. This is called Afternoon in Africa, as you see, and it might remind you of a piece that Ellington started playing several years later with Jimmy Hamilton on the clarinet, who sounded somewhat like Buster Bailey and Benny Goodman. That was called Air Conditioned Jungle. But this is 1938, Buster Bailey, O'Neill Spencer, and Billy Kyle. "1938 was really the year that the Count Basie band hit their stride. Basie was a wonderful pianist, originally from New Jersey, worked his way around the country, eventually settling in and around Kansas City, playing with a wonderful band there, led by Benny Moten. He eventually took over the Moten band when Moten passed away. They came to New York in late 36, got their act together in 1937, and in 1938, in the summer, just around the time that this recording was made, they opened at a club called The Famous Door on 52nd Street. You know, many people forget many restaurants and clubs and theaters back in those days used to close in the summer because it was so hot and there was no air conditioning in most big places. The sponsor of the band was the critic and writer John Hammond, and he agreed to put an air conditioning unit in this small club called the Famous Door if they would hire Count Basie's band. That's a little side fact there. But the big deal, of course, is the music, the brilliant rhythm section, the great soloists led by Lester Young and others. And here we catch the Basie band just at the moment when they're about to begin this famous gig. And the tune is called Doggin' Around. It's written by the first tenor sax soloist. His name was Herschel Evans. He was from Texas, and he was a giant. And the other saxophone players are also heard here. Usually you don't hear all of them on one record, but we hear Jack Washington on the baritone and Earl Warren on the alto, a bit of Buck Clayton on the trumpet, the leader on the piano, and at the end, the great Lester Young on the tenor sax. This was really something new in jazz. One of the most influential pianists of the 30s into the early 40s was Teddy Wilson. And Wilson, originally a disciple of Fats Waller, who we'll hear later on in the show, and, well, I wouldn't say a disciple of, a friend and collaborator, in a sense, on a style, with Art Tatum, who we'll also hear later on in the show. Tatum and Teddy Wilson had met early on and really traded ideas, and they both learned from one another. 1938 was really a year of years for Teddy Wilson. He made the last of the famous original small group recordings with Teddy Wilson and Billie Holiday, with Lester Young and Billie Holiday. Of course, he was working with Benny Goodman at that time, and we'll hear the Benny Goodman Quartet later on in the show. But there was something about the urbanity of his style and his precision and his coolness and the great melodies that he played and the inner voicings in his left hand. It was just, it was a style, Art Tatum's style was not really accessible for most pianists, as you'll hear later. His technique was so brilliant and he used it in such an original way. There was really no way to copy it or to adapt it. It was so unique. Teddy Wilson had the kind of style that was equally brilliant, but that was usable and that influenced, every jazz pianist who was coming up at that era. At some point, from Thelonious Monk to the young Nat Cole to the young Bud Powell, all of them were touched deeply by Teddy Wilson's work. This is a small group session that he did, not one of the better-known ones, but it has a wonderful vocalist named Nan Wynn. But the big news is that Benny Carter, who actually had brought Wilson to New York in 1933 to join his band, Benny Carter had been in Europe for a few years. He came back to the States in 1938, and this is one of the very first record sessions that he made. And we'll hear him along with one of his, well, I wouldn't say disciples, close friends, and somebody who he influenced greatly, Ben Webster on the tenor, Jonah Jones on the trumpet, and others. And anyway, this is a swing classic. Teddy Wilson at the piano with some great horn players, and a very good singer, too.
Get you, simply laugh and call it love. Hearts don't break, that's just a rumor. Where is your humor? Can't you laugh and call it love? You'll see where a big affair can soon be very small. The first 100 tears are the hardest tears of all. You forget, and there'll be new ones. And haven't you on? So just laugh and call it love.
From the time he started attaining his real greatness in the late 1920s until he passed away in 1974, Duke Ellington occupied a place in jazz apart from anyone else. His compositions the orchestra that he kept, even when he had to pay out of his own pocket, really, to keep it going after the big band era ended. Everything that Ellington did placed him in another category. We'll catch him here in August 1938, the first recording of a tune called Prelude to a Kiss. And I think at this remove of so many years, over 80 years since recordings like this were made, we're so accustomed to Ellington's greatness that it's hard to appreciate how radical a lot of his music was, and just how gorgeously innovative and new and fresh it was. Just the sounds of the band. By this point, classical composers and jazz composers and all different kinds of people were writing and saying about Ellington that no one had done with an orchestra of any size what he had done. The greatest composers, were no greater than Ellington when it came to creating his own palette of sounds and harmonies. And you can hear it here so clearly on this first recording again of Prelude to a Kiss. Among the soloists, Johnny Hodges playing the soprano saxophone. It's hard to follow Ellington, but if you have to, you can always listen to Art Tatum, who was in his own realm as unique and phenomenal, and can you only imagine how it sounded to 1938 ears as Duke Ellington. And here is Tatum, just as he is attaining his first real maturity as a composer, pianist. Now, when I say composer, he only wrote 3 or 4 songs in his life that we know about, that he recorded. But I use the word composer, maybe recomposer is more appropriate, in the way that he created variations on tunes that other people wrote. When Brahms or other composers of that era would write something on a theme by another composer, Brahms's variations of a theme of Haydn or of Paganini, they got the credit for the composition. Brahms did, because his variations were so original. And in a way, what Art Tatum does with music at times is so abstract and so brilliantly original that you could really call it his own composition, his own variations. Here, Tatum plays Body and Soul, and you can hear the reciprocal influence we referred to earlier of Teddy Wilson. He cops a little bit of Teddy Wilson's things in here, but the genre and the idiom is completely Tatum's. If you're into such things, you might want to listen to the introduction a few times, because he does things there that are not only fresh in 1938, but they were fresh in 48 and 58 and 68, and they're still fresh today. Just a crazy, beautiful introduction, and then into a very compelling version of Body and Soul. And now we go to Teddy Wilson for the second time, because it really was his year. Probably is the most influential jazz pianist of the era. Here he is with the Benny Goodman Quartet, which is how most people would have heard him in person in those days. It was quite a thing. Teddy Wilson had recorded with Goodman in 1934 and 1935. But in early 36, the pioneering jazz journalist and producer Helen Oakley created a series of sit-down jazz concerts at the venue where Goodman was playing for dancing, the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And to bring out Teddy Wilson to play with Goodman was quite a thing, because integration was happening sometimes in the recording studios, but hardly ever in person, African American and non-African American artists playing together. And Goodman loved the collaboration so much because he really was playing with a peer, which he didn't get to do very often, that he brought Wilson into the band full time. And it belongs right up there with Jackie Robinson joining the Dodgers and many other signal moments in civil rights in American history. In jazz, it was just a great combination of two brilliant individual innovators who could, down to the 16th note and the 32nd note, just match each other with alacrity. And, we'll hear the famous Goodman Quartet, Lionel Hampton on the vibes, and Teddy on the piano, Benny on the clarinet, and the drummer is Dave Tuff, Gene Krupa, who had really helped create the Goodman Band in terms of their reputation, had left. He had formed his own band. And Goodman really did a 180, whereas Gene Krupa was very extroverted in his playing, and you never knew that, I should say, you heard him at every moment of a performance, and sometimes quite loudly. He brought in Dave Tuff, who was the exact opposite of Krupa, except like Krupa, he swung like crazy. Like Krupa, he had his own sound. And Artie Shaw once described Dave Tuff as a musician, because I think he barely weighed over 100 pounds, with great psychic energy, who affected everything that he played through what was coming out of his brain and what was coming out of his hands and feet at the drums. On this particular performance, pay close attention to what he does. He hardly ever hits a drum. It's mostly clicking and clacking on the hi-hat stand, and he just really creates a whole bunch of miracles. And also pay attention to Teddy Wilson and his left hand. There's no bass in this group. Well, anyway, you can listen to everybody on this record forever. Of all the instrumental combinations that appeared in 1938, one of the most influential was guitar, bass, and piano. No drums, no horn. And one of the men who really put that together was Nat King Cole, out on the West Coast. He was from Chicago, came from a musical family. His brother was a band leader, and he was very young at the time, Nat Cole was, and he struck out to the West Coast and really spent a couple of years doing all kinds of gigs. He didn't really catch on until Lionel Hampton started paying attention to him around 1939, 1940, and then Cole began making records like Sweet Lorraine and Straighten Up and Fly Right during the World War II years, and then he was off and running to become the iconic singer and entertainer that everyone knows him as. But he was a brilliant, I know I'm using these words so frequently, but they're deserved and appropriate, a brilliantly original jazz pianist. Some of the small group sessions he made a few years later with Lester Young are among the all-time jazz classics. But here we hear something from one of his very first record dates, and it's also emblematic of a kind of tune that was very popular at this point, was the novelty tune. Just kind of, not silly lyrics, but just lyrics that aren't meant to be taken too seriously, put over a simple melody. And here, just to show how brilliant Cole was as an arranger, he took chopsticks and put words to it, and it works. And in the midst of all the vocalizing of the trio, Oscar Moore on the guitar, Wesley Prince on the bass, there's some wonderful piano playing and guitar playing. Later on, Oscar Moore became famous for his electric guitar playing with Nat King Cole and others. But here he's still playing an acoustic instrument, and it's a very early glimpse of one of the great figures who was just getting his foot in the door in 1938, Nat Cole.
Chopsticks, oh chopsticks, there's nothing like chopsticks to help any romance along. Ra-da-da-da-da-da, 4 hands start playing, 2 heads start swaying, and 2 hearts start singing a song. If one of us makes any music mistakes while we're chopping the sticks, no need to get mad, for there's nothing so bad that a couple of kisses can fix. Let's play together. We'll find out whether we'll ever be really in tune. Don't dare to stop till our hearts go pop, pop, pop. We chop the sticks. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Ra-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da. 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 Ra-da-da-da-da-da. Ra-da-da-da-da-da. Ra-da-da-da-da. Ra-da-da-da-da-da. Oh chopsticks, oh chopsticks, oh chopsticks. Ra-do-da-do-da-do-day. Let's play together. We'll find out whether we'll ever be really in tune. Don't dare to stop till our hearts go pop, pop, pop. Chop-to-chop-do-che, 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 chop the sticks.
As you've seen, we've been sharing the front page of the New York Times going through this 1938 listening session. And if you have a chance, or if you're interested, when you watch this video, you can always pause it, and just take a moment to read some of those headlines and look at what was happening in the world. I mean, today is no walk in the park, what we're going through in this country, what the world is going through. 1938 was also a very, very challenging year. If you look back at some of the summer months, there were tremendous heat waves and floods, and of course all the things happening in Europe that were happening in 1938, the things that were happening here, and all around the world. And I hope that maybe these headlines and stuff just give some context of what the world was going through at that time, how the music was wrapped up in it in a way. Of course, it had to reflect the news, and yet somehow we came out of it. And hopefully maybe there's a glimmer of hope in confronting 1938 here in 2020. We're going to hear 3 performances in a row. There'll be no separate introduction, so let me talk them down to you, and then you can really just revel in kind of like the whole history of the music is going to unfold before your ears. We start with Jelly Roll Morton, great musician from New Orleans, really the first great jazz composer. He famously said he invented jazz to get more publicity, is why he said that later on in life. However, if anybody could really claim it, I mean, he had as good a claim as most people. He was a brilliant pianist, made great records in the mid-1920s called the Jelly Roll Morton and the Red Hot Peppers. They're beautifully organized and performed. And he was kind of down on his luck by 1938. Playing in a club in Washington, D.C. Billy Taylor, Dr. Billy Taylor, the legendary jazz pianist and advocate, talked about going to see Morton play in this club, and how kind of seedy it was, and couldn't figure out how this great old man wound up in that situation. Well, someone else knew that Morton was in Washington. His name was Alan Lomax, and along with his father, John Lomax, was doing really pioneering work in recording American roots music, trying to get stuff on disc. And they invited Jelly Roll Morton to the Library of Congress for days of just recording his stories and his piano playing, his singing, and it's an incredible document. We'll hear him play the blues as only he could. We'll follow that with Mary's Idea, and it's recorded by Andy Kirk's band, a wonderful band out of Kansas City that had a genius in it. And she was the pianist, composer, and arranger for the band all throughout the 1930s into 1940. Her name was Mary Lou Williams. And there's something about her music, I'll just paraphrase something Ellington said about her, that, there was so much soul in her music, and yet she was always perpetually contemporary. She kept up with what was going on. And here in 1938, there are just little phrases in this wonderful big band performance that she wrote and arranged, composed, and plays on that just kind of point to the future in a certain kind of way that still sound just so fresh. And of course, her life as an African-American woman in the entertainment business, what she had to put up with is hard to contemplate. There's a wonderful documentary. There's more than one, but there was one on public television not that long ago that I believe you can find if you look for it. You could spend a lifetime studying the music of Mary Lou Williams. And after that, we'll conclude with a jam session that features, well, what can you say? After Louis Armstrong on the trumpet, Fats Waller on the piano, Jack Teagarden on the trombone. They all play and they sing, all 3 of them. Bud Freeman's on the tenor, Bob Spergel on the guitar, Pete Peterson on the bass, George Wetling is the drummer. And it's really, just one of the highlights. We're taking it from the Savory Collection, a very historic issue of recordings that the National Jazz Museum in Harlem found and is made available to the world. And it really kind of helps us conclude this listening session to the great music of 1938 with these 3 titles from December of that year.
This ought to be good.
My, they got me in a crack. Say, my, they got me in a crack. If Louie or Jack don't take the next one, I'm gonna break my back.
Well, you better let me sing.
You better go on and get it, son. I'm gonna grab me a picket off somebody's fence.
Oh, what kind of fence?
Listen to me, mama, I'm gonna snatch me a picket off somebody's fence. And I'm gonna whip you over your big head until you learn some sense. That's a killer.
Oh, mama, where did you stay last night? Oh, mama, where did you stay last night? 'Cause when you came home, your hair didn't look just right.
Oh, just talk. Oh, just talk.
Thank you so much for joining us for this Year in Jazz presentation, part of Jazz for Curious Listeners, and just one of the many online programs that the National Jazz Museum in Harlem is presenting. My name is Lauren Schoenberg. I'm the Senior Scholar at the museum, and again, it's been a pleasure to go through 1938 with you. Remember, there are hundreds upon hundreds of other great recordings from 1938. You might be inspired to put together your own 1938 listening session. Please join us again for more of our online programming from the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.